Don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. Keep smiling through, just like you always do, till the blue skies drive the dark clouds far away. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. Keep smiling through, just like you always do, till the blue skies drive the dark clouds far away. So will you please say hello to the folks that I know? Tell them I won't be long. They'll be happy to know that the June song ago I was singing this song. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny
fact that 25% of men survived in their first tour, and where this comes from, and he quotes where it comes from, and you can download the document from the Army Air Force Historical Research Agency in Maxwell Air Force Base, and it's on one of their microfilm reels that they have, and I could provide the page and the numbers and all that sort of stuff. But what happened was in late 1943, the 8th Air Force was starting to try and understand what the loss rates were, what were we doing. They had gone into this war without really having a good understanding about what was going on, and they were trying to play catch up. So Leslie Groves, I think that was his name, was the Surgeon General of the 8th Air Force, or one of the high officers. And it might not have been Groves. I don't have the document in front of me, but this medical doctor asked for information, and they decided to study 6 bomb groups from the 8th Air Force, and they were all B-17 groups, and so he took 3 that began flying in the fall of 1942, and then he took 3 that began flying in the spring of 1943, and then they combined the numbers. And they come up with, they had a total of something like 2,000 men out of these 6 bomb groups that were involved with flying their first mission. They said there was 35 of them that were assigned that never did fly any missions, and there was no explanation for that. And there doesn't have to be. It could be any number of reasons why a person might. But one of the reasons that looms large is this whole business of emotional stability and psychiatric fitness for going on a combat mission. So the thing about it is that they took this data from these 6 bomb groups, and they listed the number of men who completed 1 mission, 2 missions, 3 missions, 4 missions, and out of the original start, as you went down the number of missions, the number of men that were participating was dropping off. But the thing about it is that the number of men that was dropping off didn't match the casualty rate. So by the end of the 25 missions, out of 2,000 men, they had 500 and some that had completed 25 missions, but there was really only 1,100 or 1,200 that had become casualties. So there's this missing gap of 300 or 400 men that didn't complete 25 missions. but they didn't become a casualty. They weren't shot down or killed or seriously wounded in some way, shape, or form. So the thing about it is this gets back to this whole business of 25%. Mark Wells said that you had a 25% chance of surviving your tour in 1943 with the 8th Air Force. But what he really should have been saying is that you had a 25% chance of finishing your combat tour. The number of men who were shot down or killed was less than 75%, except in certain missions and in certain groups of men that came in. But the thing about it is that when you look at, like I said, in the documentary that came out here a few years ago with the Cold Blue, they refer to the fact that in 1943, the chances of surviving was 25%. And that's not what the numbers were developed from. That was the number of men who finished their combat tours of 25 missions. Now, the thing about it is there were groups of men along in there. For example, in one of the squadrons of the 91st Bomb Group, the 323rd Bomb Squadron, for the men that started flying between 1st of June 1943 to the end of August 1943, there was only 7 men out of 97 that survived. That being shot down. And 6 of those finished their combat tour of 25 missions, and 1 didn't. But so there were squadrons that had really, really high casualty rates, but on the whole, it's not helpful to sit there and come up with this number that says, well, 25% will survive when they mean 25% will finish their combat tour.
Okay. So that gap you said of those several hundred men that aren't showing up there.
Yes.
Because you mentioned it, I'm going to ask the question, is that where we get into the psychological, that they were casualties in that area?
There was some of that, but it wasn't the whole thing. For example, once a man had started to get 10 or 15 missions in there, and he was an officer, and they needed somebody to be an operations officer in a squadron, very often that man could volunteer to become that and take off flying duty. So he never became a casualty, but he never finished his 25 missions. So he would show up as one of the guys who never finished, but he wasn't a casualty. Other men were transferred. Lots of guys would go from one group to another, or one Air Force to another Air Force. Some guys were wounded. When you lose an arm from a 20 millimeter cannon shell, it's pretty hard to finish your combat tour, but you're still there. And so there's all kinds of reasons why a person might not finish your combat tour, but it doesn't imply that your chances of surviving, although when you're minus an arm, you're very definitely affected. But it's one of those things that the numbers that they're giving don't square with what really happened.
Understood. Wow.
And this basically is the extent to which I was going to discuss this evening.
No, I was just going to say I'm enjoying it.
Absolutely. The depth of research that you've done on this is insane, and it's mind blowing. It really is. This whole time my jaw has been just wide open. It's like, wow. It's amazing how things get covered up. The amount that you've done is phenomenal. It's so appreciative and so eye-opening.
Amen.
Well, thank you very much.
Now, I would like, because I know we were conversing here over these last weeks, but I would like for you to kind of share a little bit about the Scarecrow Flares.
Yes.
Kind of, if you don't mind.
Yeah, if a person does a search on Google for Scarecrow Flares, you'll find images that are in like the Imperial War Museum and stuff like that. What the British Bomber Command people, they were going out at night, and they were flying, and on a bomber stream. They didn't fly in formation, and the Germans would have night fighters in the air, and the night fighters would have ground controllers. So they would when the ground controller picked up a bomber on radar, they would vector the night fighter into the locality of the British bomber. So they had modified a lot of their aircraft, so they had vertical firing 30-millimeter cannon with exploding heads in them. And so what they would typically do is that when they came in from underneath for a British bomber, they could see the exhaust flame coming from the engines, and they could position themselves underneath. And then as they were coming in underneath, they would fire upwards. And the idea was to fire into the wing to hit the fuel tanks and start the airplane on fire. But every now and then they would sit there and hit the bomb bay, and the plane would blow up. And so in the reports that you see in the operations record books that are filled out by the bomber crews when they came back, they would talk about seeing airplanes exploding, and they couldn't explain it because they didn't know why. And the bomber command people got very concerned about the drop in morale. So they came up with a story that the Germans were really dropping bombs from above the bomber stream that were designed to go off in the bomber stream to resemble an exploding aircraft. And they called these Scarecrow Flares. And so I was telling Chris here when I was talking to him last night there that I have books written by guys that were RCAF aircrew that were, bomb aimers, navigators, radio operators. And in the 1980s, when they were writing their memoirs about their experience during the war, and they hadn't had time to do any research or anything like that, and they would report that as they would be on a certain mission when they're going to a certain German city, that they would look ahead and know that they were on the right path because they could see the Scarecrow flares going off in front of them, in the air in the distance in front of them. And those were not Scarecrow flares, those were British bombers blowing up.
And they knew, and they didn't share with them that, hey, you're tactically vulnerable here.
Yeah, the air ministry knew, because they knew the Germans didn't have Scarecrow flares and that these were bombers that were blowing up, but they didn't want to alarm their air crew, so they were lying to them, telling them, oh well, that's just a Scarecrow flare. That's not a bomber blowing up.
That is totally insane. That is so hard to wrap my head around.
I know when he told me that last night, I was flabbergasted.
Yeah, and I invite anyone to go and type into Google, type up Scarecrow flares, and it'll talk about them. This is not something that's hidden or anything like that. It's well known nowadays.
I'd never heard that. That just is it's staggering to me. I mean, it really is. You had referenced in our conversations about the thought process of the United States Air Force, Army Air Corps, and how they developed, the Air Corps Tactical School. And I was looking at some other scholarship work, and repeating the theory of the bomber will always get through, and which leads to the assumption, kind of like what Biddle is talking about here in her work. If the bomber gets through, then that means the bomber's unstoppable. So that means why fly? So we can fly in daylight. And then, we've got this great tool called the Norden bomb sight. In the fallacy of, we can drop a bomb in a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet. So then we could be, daylight precision bombing, and we'll just got to fly high enough so we can get above all that stuff. And that's literally as far as they went with their thought process, which has a huge ripple effect to the war effort and the cost of men and material.
Truly. So the thing about it is when the Air Corps Tactical School drew up their notion of bomber doctrine, which was very similar to the bomber command in the RAF bomber doctrine, except that we have this difference on night flying versus day flying, that they had this, in the 1930s when the Air Corps Tactical School was drawing this up, there was no such thing as radar. And so the idea that you could form up a formation of bombers outside a country's borders and then fly into that country undetected and you could bomb any city in that you chose to, any target that you chose to. That was reality in the 1930s. And the fact of the matter is that the fighter technology at that time was behind what the bomber technology was. So, like for example, in Britain in 1939, when the war broke out, they still had aircraft that, you know, like Hurricanes, that were fabric covered wings with wooden propellers. You know, like the technology was way behind what the bomber technology was, and the bomber technology was nothing to write home to mother about either. You know, I mean, the B-17 at that time was kind of the cutting edge, and it wasn't even really a B-17 yet. But the thing about it is that this notion that the bomber will always get through had some credence at that time, but the technology in the war caught up very quickly with what was going on, and the British had developed radar to detect, you know, German aircraft that were approaching the British shores, but they did not know that the Germans had detected had developed this form of radar as well. And if you remember from watching Masters of the Air, they talk about the fact that, you know, the German fighters would be coming up being monitored by Würzburg radar. Well, the Würzburg was the German form of radar, and you know, the early forms at any rate. So the thing about it is that they were able to track when the British were sending aircraft toward Germany, and their fighters, excuse me, their fighters had a higher level of technology than what the bombers were capable of. So in 1939, when the war broke out, they started sending daylight missions to attack naval targets first in Germany, and then, you know, they were looking at what else they could do. But the thing is, they had 2 missions in December of 1939, and they weren't large raids as such. They were like 25 bombers, 30 bombers. They weren't real large, but the thing about it is that the Germans intercepted them and shot down half of the aircraft in each mission, and that really shocked the RAF, and that was the turning point where they decided that they had to go from daylight bombing to nighttime bombing, and so it was one of those things that you had this intersection with reality that forced the British. They had no other options because their aircraft weren't capable of defeating the German fighters, and so they switched to nighttime bombing, and all that ensued from that. Because once they were flying at night, they didn't have radio navigation. They didn't, you know, of course, they wouldn't have had radar. They didn't have LORAN. They didn't have all these navigation things, and they didn't know where they were dropping their bombs. So in the fall of 1941. They were concerned with the losses that the RAF Bomber Command were taking, and they didn't seem to be achieving what the RAF leaders said that they should be achieving. So there was a bureaucrat in one of the politicians had asked this bureaucrat to have a look at what was going on, and he found out that something like 20% of the bombers were dropping their bomb loads within 5 miles of the target. Well, if you're aiming at a specific factory and you're landing with it, you know, your bombs are landing within 5 miles, that was considered to be a good thing, because most of the aircraft were all over the place. They had no idea where their bombs were. They didn't have navigation thing. They would sit there and fly on a certain heading. You know, they would calculate their estimated airspeed, and they would fly for an hour and 40 minutes and assume that they were over the target and drop their bombs. And down below there'd be cloud cover. They wouldn't be able to see where they're going. They'd turn around and come back and call it a successful operation. When you read through the Martin Middlebrook's Bomber Command War Diary, he talks in there about every day's operations in there, and sometimes the bomb spread was so wide that, you know, between the aircraft that were dropping these bombs, that the Germans didn't even know what the intended target was going to be, because there was bombs falling everywhere. And so, you know, this whole business of how effective the strategic bombing was, you know, there was all these questions that came up, and it took a long time to get to the point where they could start using the H2S radar and the H2X and the GH radar and all that sort of stuff. It took a long time to come up with that. And then by that time, Germany's basically defeated, and we're on our way to Japan, and we dropped 2 atomic bombs, and all of a sudden now we don't need large air forces anymore because now we have nuclear weapons that can take out a whole city.
That's I want to go back to the Nuremberg raid by Middlebrook. How many RAF bombers were lost on that night of March 30, 31?
I'd have to check it up, but I believe it was 99 were shot down and another 7 or 8 crashed and were not repairable. So they lost like 106 bombers that night.
How many did they send up?
They sent something on the order of 600.
That's still,
yeah, I mean, the thing about it is when you consider that, this is at a time when the RAF pilots are looking at completing 50 operations before they can get out of there. That was a pretty staggering loss. That was their equivalent to what happened to the 8th Air Force with 2nd Schweinfurt, where they lost 60 bombers shot down over the continent, and another 9 that were written off when they crashed back in England.
Staggering, very sobering. Well, if I'm going to read a comment here that Sniper put in there, and he goes, and by the way, the Sniper is a pilot in our game, and he does a lot of. We have a component in our game that has a strategic layer that you can fly from. On either side, you can fly to your opponent's factories, and you can bomb it, and then has an impact to the war plant production, which links to supply in our game, because supply or attrition is a component in our game. So he flies a lot. So he says here, awesome info. Thanks for doing all of this and for sharing it with us. It's interesting how much has been forgotten in history and doesn't get discussed or brought up. And so kudos, Jim, for what you're doing. Very good. And so I do want to leave with, if there's not any other questions there, there's 2 little anecdotes I want Jim to share, and then we'll wrap up for the evening unless someone has any additional questions here. And these are rather humorous, but with a historical undertone. I would like for you to talk about the 2 different instances. You talked about German pilots, one that was in your family that you met, and then one about I don't understand I don't recall the linkage to who was a bartender one night. And so if you can share those 2 stories, have at it. I think that they're marvelous stories about history and how we are connected.
Yes, and it was the same individual. It was the same German fellow, and I met him once at a Christmas dinner in the early 1980s, and at that time he would have been in his mid 60s, late 60s, and I did not know. Now, my mother's second husband was Polish, and him and his family had come over from Poland after the war, and they had spent the war in the German slave labor camps. So I mean, when people talk to me about the Holocaust and Holocaust denial and stuff like that, the only difference between my mother's husband's family and the Jews was the fact that they were Catholic. So they ended up in the slave labor camps, not in the concentration camps. So this was a very real thing, and it turns out that one of the family friends was this couple from Germany, and I got talking to him, and he would talk about flying, and I said to him, I said, well, did you ever see any combat? And he says, I have 28 kills. And I said, holy smokes. I said, were you ever shot down? He said 5 times, 3 times into the channel. And so it was so funny to be talking to a German Luftwaffe pilot at a meeting where the head of the household had been through the German slave labor camps on there. So when we were talking this gets back to the second kind of part of the deal, when they had came to Canada, they had by this time NATO is Germany's part of NATO, and so therefore he's a member of the Royal Canadian Legion, and he would work part-time in the Legion at the bar as a bartender. And so one night his manager came to him and said, well, do you want to work this weekend, because we're having a reunion here and we need somebody to work the bar. And he didn't have a lot of money, so he said, sure, this is a few extra dollars, he'd be happy to do that. So it turned out the squadron that was having the reunion was a fighter squadron that had been in the RCAF that had flown out of North Africa, and he had spent 9 months flying in the North African campaign himself. So he said it was a very small air war, that, you know, they didn't have many airplanes. They didn't, you know, on both sides. And that when you were up in dogfights, you know, and when you were attacking certain targets and the you know, the enemy fighters would come up, you would start to recognize which you know, who you were up against. You could tell individual aircraft and who the pilots were. And so he said there was kind of a real sense of gallantry and knighthood and, you know, chivalry and all this sort of stuff that you didn't have when people were flying over Russia or when people were flying over Europe, because this, you know, in flying over the desert, he said nobody was really prepared to die if they didn't have to, but they, you know, they were trying to do their job. But, you know, if this other guy, if his guns jammed, well, you'd wave your wings and away you'd go and let him come back for another day. And so anyway, he was sitting at this bar during this air squadron reunion. And one of the guys said to him, he says, well, what are you doing here? He says, we fought you on the other side. And the guy says, well, I'm Canadian. You know, this bartender says, I'm a Canadian, so I got just as much right to be here as anybody. So this fellow, this Canadian that's talking to him, his friend says to him, says, well, don't worry about it. He says, everybody knows the Germans couldn't fly. And this German fellow told me, he says, I couldn't let that pass. He says, I had to talk. He says, so he says, I said to them, you guys flew in North Africa. And they said, yes, of course. Why? He says, did you ever see a Messerschmitt with certain markings? And he named off what they were. And it would have been like code letter LZ-X or whatever on it there with a, you know, with a red painted tail and a yellow nose or something. I don't recall the exact numbers, you know, the exact things, but he said to him, did you ever see this Messerschmitt? And the guy says, well, why? And he said, yes, you know, why? And he says, because that was me. And the one guy reached over and grabbed him by the lapels of his jacket and pulled him over the bar and dragged him over to the table and sat him down. He was holding him down while they were calling for the manager. And he thought to myself, well, he says, this is where I get this licking that I've been waiting to get, you know. And he was fully expecting that they were going to beat on him and you know, out of spite or something like that. So the manager comes over and he says, what's the problem? And these two guys look at the manager and they sat there and said, find another bartender, because we're buying this guy drinks for the rest of the night.
I love that story. That is,
Yeah. And the gentleman that I was talking to, he passed away about 3 or 4 years later, and I never got a chance to talk to him again.
hey, Sniper, if you have a question, please just unmute. You're good to go, my good man.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, or hopefully a quick question, in regards to the defensive armament. I know you talked mainly about B-24s, B-17s, but was there MGs and different tailgun positions truly worth it if they were coming up against formations of 250 to 500 enemy fighters that were intercepting them? How did that kind of dictate the survivability of a bomber crew making it through a mission compared to maybe earlier in the war where they're flying Wellingtons or something smaller that has like you mentioned earlier, 303s versus 50 cals, and then a smaller crew, so less guns, less positions.
That's an excellent question, and you know, I know I've read books by RAF pilots who were very outraged at the fact that the British bombers didn't have like ball turrets underneath, you know, like belly gunners. They felt very vulnerable on that kind of stuff. And yet at the same time, when you look at the difference, to say, between the B-17F and the B-17G, you know, the primary visual thing that you'll notice is the fact that the B-17G has a chin turret, which was designed to protect from head-on attacks. But the thing is, the differential in fighters' speeds, you know, versus head-on versus coming in from astern or at any other degree of the clock, was such that the Germans would end up flying around in a general melee and attacking from all directions. And it like, there's this kind of a general consensus that the tighter your formation, the better chances you have of surviving. But the problem is that if you look at the October 14th, 1943 mission to Schweinfurt, the Germans were using rockets, and there was one of the bomb groups in that mission was the 306th, and they had 15 bombers. They'd started out with 18, and 3 had aborted and turned back. So they were flying a formation of 15 bombers, and they were all tightly tucked in, and the Germans lobbed rockets in and shot down 10 of the 15 bombers. So this was one of those things that was evolving. But when you sit there and look at these flexible gun positions like they had with the waist gunners, and try to imagine trying to engage a target at a closing speed of 500 miles an hour, where you're going from 1 mile range, half-mile range to past you in just a matter of a couple of seconds. It was a very dicey thing to sit there and try and say with any confidence that you could defend that bomber. And this is why it was so important to have the long-range escort fighters.
So
Yeah. Makes sense. Thank you.
Good question, Sniper. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, I know we have run a little long, Jim, and my apologies for that, but such an awesome presentation of information.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you.
In closing, I would like to again extend a tremendous thank you to Jim Szpajcher for answering a random email from a gaming company. Mr. Szpajcher's work is incredibly important to many people, but especially for the families of the 91st Bomb Group. A significant portion of Szpajcher's work revolves around the 91st, and his diligent research does provide some answers to decades-old questions of what did my father, grandfather, family member experience during their combat tour? Or more soberly, what were the experiences of their last days up to and including the mission on the day they failed to return to base? The study of history is important. As proven in this series, truth is fragile, and how without diligence, conjecture becomes fact, while the real truth fades and is ultimately lost. Asking difficult questions to be supported or refuted by primary source information is important. And access to such information should be shared without filter to all who ask. A lifetime has passed. Cloaking or restricting such information on the guise of insufficient funds or manpower is laughable, considering the people's taxes have already paid for the development of that information, some of which has been paid in full with their blood or lives. Post the information not to a select few historians who have the financial means or time to overcome the bureaucracy, but available to the masses in general. People have the right to know the designs and functions of governments past, present, and future. For what it is worth, the previous statements are my own. On a personal note, I hope this series has been informative, and any shortcomings visually are my own technical limitations. More so, this series has reminded me of the service performed by many of my uncles who served in the European, North African, and Pacific theaters of war, ranging from the shores of the Mediterranean, the skies of Europe, the oceans of the Pacific, to the airfields of Tinian and the atomic bomb. Somehow, maybe providentially, they all came home, and rarely, if ever, uttered a word of their service, hardship, and sacrifice. I have a better understanding of the risk and terror two uncles in particular experienced during their service. One, a ball turret gunner on a B-24 with the 458th Bomb Group. Then the other, a B-17 co-pilot in the Bloody 100th Bomb Group. How one of them waited for the other to reach the innocent age of 18 before they volunteered together, and that innocent decision of delay dramatically increased their chances of survival. They were stationed not too far from one another and apparently were able to visit one another several times. I do wonder if they worried about the other, as one was in a high-risk position and the other in a unit known for casualties. Their friendship lasted a lifetime, as post-war they married sisters, raised families, and made a difference in their communities and places of worship. Tens of thousands were not so fortunate in the skies of Europe during those horrific years of World War II.